Cousin Marion. Our 1961 move to Paris introduced one major addition to the restricted circle of family members that I was aware of, Cousin Marion. I had no experience with cousins growing up. Did I even know I had cousins on my father's side? I doubt it. I had never met them, and their names didn't register as family if they were spoken of. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a cousin emerged on my mother's side. She lived in Paris and apparently had been living there a long time. None of this had been explained to me, and in fact, Amy and Marion, first cousins, had known one another in their youth, adolescence, and even as young wives in new marriages, but they had never bonded. There was a 5-year age gap, and they had grown up in different cities. Both were granddaughters of the Polish immigrant Joris Goldstein, but Marion's mother, Anna, had married a man from Cleveland. Anna was not cut out to be a wife and mother. She was, however, rather brilliant. She enrolled at the University of Chicago and graduated with a Phi Beta Kappa key. This did nothing to enhance her marriage prospects, and in 1905, such was a woman's destiny. It took a while. Several years passed, but while visiting the Vilja-Lied cousins in Cleveland, she met Milton Koblitz, an insurance man who had received his training with Pacific Life. Milton had observed firsthand the devastation of San Francisco's great earthquake of 1906, but was more shaken by his meeting with Anna Goldstein. Smitten, he conducted a long-distance courtship, and when she agreed to be his bride, they married in Chicago as custom demanded, but moved to Cleveland, where Milton had his roots. Although shrewd in business matters, Milton had mistaken the kind of woman he'd taken for a wife. "Your mother never kissed me on the lips once we were married," he told his daughter. Sexual relations between the couple were infrequent, but Anna managed to get pregnant and gave birth to Marion in 1914. It was a hard labor. Anna later showed her daughter the delivery chair with fingernail marks clawed into its wooden arms. "Don't have children, Marion," she said, the extent of her motherly counsel. She ignored her own advice and gave birth to a second daughter 3 years later. Anna considered children a nuisance and wasn't much interested in her own. She was an intellectual, finding her delight in reading and studying languages. Marion grew up in the curious freedom of her mother's indifference. If Anna wasn't maternal, neither was she demanding. Her main concern was that her daughter's hands be clean. Other than that, Marion was free to live her life as she pleased, mostly through reading. When my grandmother Jeanette Goldstein visited her family in Cleveland with her daughter, she would call on her sister-in-law, but Marion refused to play with Amy. She preferred to read. Milton was always high-strung, but as the years passed, his behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He suffered from a persecution complex and developed delusional theories about how the Japanese were taking over America. When Marion was 12, he suffered a full-scale nervous breakdown, rupturing the tenuous veneer of normality that public perception had draped over the family. Milton wasn't financially ruined because, while in California, he had insured himself against every possible eventuality, so there was some money for his wife and children. Nonetheless, Anna was dropped by Cleveland society, quote, because she was poor and her husband was crazy, as Marion later related to me. Even Anna's wealthy in-laws, the Koblitzes, treated her as a poor relation and an embarrassing reminder of family scandal, all of which convinced Marion at a young age that the world in which she had been reared was worthless and hypocritical. Anna stayed in Cleveland, but mentally, Marion had already left. I wanted to get away, and I knew the only kind of people I wanted to be around were creative. It wasn't that I felt a great artistic vocation, I just wanted to get away. Fuir là-bas. The quote from Mallarmé is not out of place, for I only knew Marion in her French context. She and her husband, Jean Guillard, lived in an apartment on the narrow street lined with gray six-storied buildings fronting similar balconies and mansard roofs. Going there, invited for dinner, was the first of our family outings when we moved to Paris in 1961, and it made an impression on me. You had to press a buzzer at the great door of the porte cochère. A loud click triggered by the concierge signaled that you could now push the heavy portal, go past this dark apartment, and enter the stairwell opposite. With no exterior windows, the stairwell was illuminated by the push of a button that kept the weak lights on only for a minute. Then you had to push another button at the next landing to achieve the same result. This seemed very odd to me. The steps themselves were narrow, with steep risers, stained a deep brown. The clatter of our 12-foot steps ascended into the gloom of the stairwell's top, who knows how many stories up. And there was no elevator. Fortunately, Marion's landing was only 2 flights up. This was also confusing because Marion told us her apartment was on the first floor. Cousin Marion's dinner invitation was a lovely gesture of hospitality, but it did not go well. A number of novelties struck our American certainties as odd. The kitchen was tiny. Why were the shower and sink in one small room and the toilet exiled to a closet? Why were there 2 different bedrooms for a married couple? The floor plan made no sense. The rooms were rectangles of different sizes, none of them roomy, describing a rough circle with the kitchen separated from the very narrow dining room by a short corridor. The salon, the largest room, housed stacks of incomprehensible canvases, swirls of lines and colors, often sporting a sun-like circle, sometimes vaguely referencing the human form. The artist was Jean Guillard. Jean was not a painter when Marion met him in the early 1950s. He made his living as a civil servant in tax collection. Profoundly uninterested in the work that provided his income, he never spoke of it, and we never asked. When they married in 1954, Jean discovered, under Marion's influence, his vocation as a painter and pursued it with passion. In 1961, he had no place to store his growing collection. His paintings almost filled the modest living room, but that would be remedied before we left Paris 2 years later. Marion could not have married a man who wasn't an artist. Picking up his palette at 40 and entirely self-taught, Jean never enjoyed the success of his ambition, but the passion was real, and that was enough for Marion. From the time she left Cleveland and eventually wound up at her mother's alma mater, the University of Chicago, she had always been attracted to artists, and the feeling was returned. When she visited Taliesin with some girlfriends, Frank Lloyd Wright invited them all to join his workshop. They declined. She tried her hand at writing. I had the aptitude and good fortune to get accepted by Thornton Wilde into his composition class, and it was there that he scared me out of ambitious literary efforts by telling me I was ready to work on a novel. Although Marion wasn't destined to pen fiction, she cultivated writers. One of the guests at our inaugural dinner, Chez Marion, was the son of her good friend, Doris Lessing, then 15, the same age as my brother David. Junior Lessing appeared in a suit and tie and was, as family lore has it, a proper little prig, although it's likelier he was simply polite, a stark contrast to the Philipson progeny. I was fascinated by how far one could slide on the throw rug covering the wooden floor of the dining room, until sharply reprimanded to stop my experiments in friction. David and Alice sniggered over the stacks of canvases in the living room, while Mother tried to stanch the flow of childish derision. Jeannie fingered, under their owner's distracted gaze, the beautiful collection of carved boxes and nested dolls from Eastern Europe. Marion scarcely hid her preference for the prig. This did not augur well for the establishment of warm relations between the cousins. There was a past to build on, an amalgamation of left-wing politics, ubiquitous during the Depression years, and its frequent corollary, free love. During the summer of her freshman year, Marion had gone to Europe on a tour arranged by her father, recovered from his breakdown and living in Baltimore under the terms of an amicable separation. Any grand tour taken during these times had to include a visit to the workers' paradise, and so Marion spent 3 weeks in the Soviet Union. She also had her first sexual experience when a young American working for the Moscow Daily News convinced her that female virginity was a bourgeois notion to be discarded. I was much more of a virgin after I slept with David Lawrence than before. Back home, Marion spoke to communist groups about her trip to the Soviet Union, and thus fell in with the radicals at the University of Chicago. When she was arrested with her communist friends for appearing on a Negro Lake Michigan beach with black comrades, she spent the night in jail and told the police that her name was Rosa Luxemburg. The Chicago-based Goldsteins learned of the incident, and she was officially branded a black sheep. Well, a red one. Verboten, in any case. "I don't ever want to catch you going over to your cousin Marion's," Jeanette told her daughter then in high school. "You won't," Amy replied, and she didn't. Marion had opened a left-wing bookstore in Hyde Park with her communist friends, and her pad behind was a garden of forbidden delights. When Marion had her friends over for huge pots of spaghetti, she invited her younger cousin. Amy would listen wonderingly to discussions of the proletarian struggle, the wise leadership of Papa Joe, and the inevitability of a communist revolution in depression-racked America. The University of Chicago communists were dirt-poor, brilliant Jewish students, equally starved for food and sex, my father told me when I asked him about that period. Such wasn't the case with Marion's communist boyfriend, Severin. He wasn't Jewish, and since Marion was sleeping with him, he wasn't starved for sex either, much to my mother's scandalized delight. Marion hadn't yet found her artistic medium, but learned photography while in Chicago and prepared for a career in journalism. The combination of the visual arts and left-wing politics fused into an unusual ambition for a young woman. Quote, "Coming straight to New York, a Leica slung over my shoulder, I had one idea in mind, to learn how to make documentary films," unquote.
O maidens fair as your eyes, gaze upon the road we follow. Far and away the road goes winding. Look and see how merrily the road goes on.
She moved to New York. Where else to go with such an ambition in the late 30s? And eventually found her way to a left-wing film collective, Frontier Films, passionately committed to populist documentaries. Its founders, Leo Hurwitz and Paul Strand, had already cut their teeth on the Parle-Lorenz classic, The Plow That Broke the Plains, and were engaged in an ambitious feature-length documentary about the campaign of terror against unionization, featuring the basso profundo of Paul Robeson. Marion had beginner's luck, but not the vision or ambition to push her opportunities towards a sustained career. While in New York, she published a children's photo book with Bobs Merrill. No others were to follow. Strand was invited by the Mexican government to make a documentary, Primary Education, part of its agenda of social reform. With a highly exaggerated belief in my capacities, Marion wrote, Paul recommended that I replace him. The project found her. No footage was ever shot, but the photographs of daily life that Marion had made ended up being exhibited in the famous Frank Pearl's Gallery on Sunset Boulevard. The show was titled Portraits by Man Ray and Marion Michel. It was an auspicious start, but she did not exhibit again until the very end of her life. Marion had dropped her surname, at least in her professional life. She was Marion Michel. While in New York, she had married Joe Vogel, an immigrant painter from Poland, but declined to take his name. She did bring him to Mexico and thence to Los Angeles after the Mexican film debacle to try her luck in Hollywood. And it was there in Los Angeles that the cousins crossed paths again. Amy and Joe lived near the University of Southern California, where Joe was working on a doctorate in chemistry, until his distaste for the status-obsessed campus culture drove him into the welcoming arms of the aerospace industry. In wartime America, employment opportunities abounded. Even Amy, a young woman with no work experience, easily found a job with the Selective Service Board. Marion lived with her Joe in Laurel Canyon. The age gap between the cousins was not the obstacle it had once been, but when the two couples attempted to socialize, no sparks flew. My parents found Joe Vogel taciturn, and the cousins didn't seem to have much in common. Joe and Amy had experienced little exposure to contemporary art, and Vogel's version of biomorphism didn't much kindle their interest. As a goodwill gesture, they purchased one of his canvases that explained the stealthy incursion of abstract art into what was otherwise an eclectic but strictly representative art household. The original Joe Vogel, as we dubbed it with more than a touch of snark, took up long residence on the wall opposite my bed, and I would spend hours contemplating the black slipper that topped a flesh-colored pogo stick. Other images represented, as best I could tell, the monstrous offspring of fruit, letter openers, and household furniture, all engaged in acts made unspeakable by their menacing indecipherability. This melting and mutating took place on a brilliant blue background that was itself far from being the brightest color. Such an unnatural potpourri had sinister and unforeseen effects. I was primed for the scary attacks perpetrated by the Baroque angels of my Parisian bedroom. I didn't know about the connection of the original Joe Vogel to cousin Marion, but she became a frequent guest in our apartment and sometimes joined us on our family excursions. There were no more dinners at her place, and her husband Jean kept aloof. He wasn't interested in children and had steadfastly refused to learn English, though there wasn't much incentive for him to take time away from his art. Marion, it turned out, was much like Mother, voluble, enthusiastic, life-affirming. She was also elegant and attractive, and schooled my mother about style and makeup. Once again, Marion could play the mentor, only this time the education was not about socialism, but about food, culture, art, men, movies, and Paris.
I love Paris in the springtime. I love Paris in the fall. I love Paris in the winter when it drizzles. I love Paris in the summer when it sizzles.
Amy was a willing student, and Marion found that her little cousin had emotional depths and an understanding of human nature that she had not previously suspected. Though Marion was fluent in her débrouillard French, she loved the English language, and with Amy, she could express her deepest thoughts. Amy had chosen a more conventional life, but Marion found that her cousin was not a conventional woman. Amy took in the life of Paris streets and buildings through all her senses. She wanted to immerse herself in French culture, attending daily language classes at the Alliance Française. After 6 months, Amy had mastered French well enough to argue politics with Marion's husband, who had become a communist sympathizer working in the French resistance during the war and viewed the world through the peculiarly French amalgam of socialism and chauvinism. Just after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963, Jean said to my mother, "Well, your president almost blew the world up. Is communism really so bad that you'd rather commit suicide and take the rest of us with you?" Jean had a trick of laying the responsibility for American activities around the world at my mother's door, which both infuriated and challenged her. He had the advantage over my mother, not only on the linguistic level, but because his communist background had provided him with a foundation in historical materialism. Paris was truly an international city, as well as being intensely French, and in her arguments with Marion's husband, Amy had to broaden her political horizons to counter Jean's multi-front attacks. Marion's socialist bona fides were already well established by her affair and collaboration with one of the most famous left-wing documentary filmmakers of the period, Joris Ivens.
I had the craziest dream last night. Yes, I did. I never dreamt it could be. Yet there you were in love with me. I found your lips close to mine, so I kissed you, and you didn't mind it at all.
When Marion and Joris met in Hollywood, Ivens was already a celebrity in the rarefied world of documentary film, both for his poetic vision and his steadfast communist sympathies. Although of Dutch origin, he had based himself in the United States since 1936, directing, amongst his prolific output, the famous anti-fascist brief for the doomed republic, This Spanish Earth. Marion, wanting to see what the big industry was like, had worked on a number of jobs, finally snagging a position to her liking, vetting scripts for the Office of War Information. The Taft Building housed not only the OWI, but the Frank Capra unit, where the famous director was overseeing a legendary series of propaganda documentaries for the war effort. Ivens was working on one of these when he and Marion shared an elevator ride. To her surprise, the phrase, "Let's have lunch together sometime," popped out of Marion's mouth as she exited on the 3rd floor. The next day, Joris took her to lunch at the swankiest restaurant in town, the Players on Sunset Strip. Within 2 weeks, they were referring to each other as Mr. and Mrs. Pumpkin. Unbeknownst to Marion, there was already a Mrs. Ivens, Joris's longtime editing collaborator and lover of 15 years, Helen von Dongen. At her insistence, they had formalized their relationship in a marriage contracted just 2 days before Joris met Marion. This might have been awkward, but Marion had a husband herself and so was in no position to throw stones. Eventually, they separated from their spouses, and when Ivens was asked to become film commissioner of the Dutch East Indies, he flew to Australia, home to the colony's government in exile. 3 months later, Marion sailed to Sydney in a little Dutch cargo boat to join the Joris Ivens film unit. The Japanese conquered the Dutch colony in 1942 and were still in control when America dropped a couple of atomic bombs in August of 1945. The Japanese capitulated shortly thereafter and were commanded by the Allies to maintain order in the country until the Dutch could return as overlords. 350 years of brutal colonial rule hadn't won their subjects' hearts, however. On August 17th, the Japanese consented, what did they care, to the establishment of an independent Republic of Indonesia. Thousands of soldiers and citizens died in fighting and raids in the months that followed. When news of the rebellion made its way to Australia, It didn't take long for Ivens to throw his lot in with the anti-colonialists. From the window of the apartment that Joris and Marion shared, the Indonesian conflict visibly played out on the Sydney docks. During the war, ships of the Dutch colonial navy manned by Indonesian crews had been stationed in Australian ports. The Dutch wanted to use these ships to recapture their old colony, but the crew and waterside workers initiated a boycott that spread to all of Australia's ports. On November 21, 1945, Ivens resigned his position with the Dutch government, instantly losing access to all crew and equipment. But he had already decided to secretly film a short propaganda piece about the boycott, Indonesia Calling.
Dutch couldn't get anybody to man their ships, and the Australian waterfront workers declared all Dutch ships black. Meantime, things were happening along the waterfront. It was a place very hard to get to because it was very much watched after the war. The waterfront is a dangerous place and highly policed. So I went as an American camera lady doing a film on tourism in Australia. So I got away with it a little bit, and I did some shooting, and things really began to happen. The Dutch ships were really blocked, and it became a very dramatic story. Indonesia Calling developed in front of our eyes. Joris said to me, well, you just got to go out and shoot. I had a small Kinamo camera that does 75 feet, so every 75 feet you have to stop and wind it up again. And we had bits of film that pals had given us that had come back from the jungle. We didn't know what we were shooting with.
There was no preparation, Marion wrote. Everything would be improvised. No more crew, just Joris and myself with a few stalwart Aussie supporters. Filming had to be furtive, for the docks and the waterfront were carefully guarded. Contacts were maintained through trade union representatives and responsible members of the Indonesia seamen. From one day to the next, we didn't know what would happen in the tense atmosphere of the strike. I lived on standby, my camera always ready, loaded for action. Joris was in his element, in control, alert to every possibility of enriching our material with daily events. And finally, from a modest reserve of film shot in the urgency of action, he patched together a moment of history still significant in its implications for those who see it today.
Well, I think we have 25 meters of film, and the film is 22 meters, you can imagine. Our cutting room was owned by a man called Murph, and Murph said, if Ivens can make a film out of this, I can make Ben-Hur in my backyard.
Seeing Indonesia Calling before the advent of the internet would have been a challenge. The Dutch government and Australian conservators demanded that the film be banned from exhibition. Smuggled to the former colony, the film served as an inspirational expression of support to Indonesians under siege. Ivens secured a semi-permanent place on the Dutch government's shit list, and the accelerating polarization of the Cold War didn't encourage a retrospective screening of anti-colonialist documentaries. I myself would have never witnessed my cousin's work had I not been living in Paris at the time of a Joris Ivens retrospective at the Pompidou Center. The year was 1977, and I was in the City of Lights once again, this time of my own volition after having served in the Central African Republic. My French was good, and I gave myself the challenge and the pleasure of studying la littérature francophone at the University of Paris. The 2 years my family had spent in Paris 15 years ago had changed us in varying ways to varying degrees. With the exception of my older sister Alice, who hated her life there, the rest of us children found ways to get back. Marion was our anchor, and we all established individual relations with her. This was not an unmixed blessing. We were all troubled in our own ways and brought our troubles to Paris. David, the eternal fuck-up, was the first to try his hand. 2 years after returning home, He enrolled as a freshman at the American University of Paris with my parents' support. Marion kept Amy informed as David quickly dropped out, played guitar in the streets, and offered his services as a guide to American tourists to supplement the allowance allocated for his studies. When the cash flow stanched, he returned home that winter, and my parents installed him in a tent on the backyard lawn. 8 years later, Jeannie spent her junior year in Paris, which, though more successful as an academic venture, provided new challenge for Marion in loco parentis. Being the first to confront her burgeoning same-sex desires, Jeannie talked through her experiments in bisexuality with her older cousin. Marion was plenty experienced in affairs of the heart, but had little advice to offer about lesbian relations. She came around big time as things evolved and suggested to my mother when they were visiting Sweden together in the mid-'80s that they have a go at it. Mother recounted the story with a mixture of horrified disbelief and comic delight. And then there was me. After 3 years of near celibacy in Africa, I was ready to get laid, but terrified of coming out. In other ways, I gloried in the bravery of youth. I'd ridden into Paris that spring of '77 on a Honda 250 that I'd bought in Nigeria and taken on a 5-month overland odyssey. My hormones, those of a healthy young man, exploded into frustrated desire once I had re-entered the highly sexualized world of Western advertising. Some of the huge posters plastered on the walls of the metro stations shamelessly appealed to whatever pornography one might be susceptible to: food, fashion, breasts, chests, and of course, the featured models, impossibly beautiful, invited one's prurient gaze. Ashamed of my desires, I sublimated furiously through writing, teaching English, taking on a heavy course load meant for native French speakers, walking interminably, and pouring through the list of 100-plus movies from world cinema that played in Paris on any given day. I considered Marion an integral part of my support system, but given her experiences with my siblings, she was hesitant about integrating me into her life. When she invited me to her apartment, I showed up grizzled from my trans-Saharan travels and startled her as she finished her preparations in the kitchen by exclaiming, "What the fuck?" Coming into the dining room, she asked, "What is it, Robert?" in worried tones. She always pronounced my name the French way, which I liked. I looked at her with eyes both dazed and panicked. I'm sorry, Marion. I've been traveling alone for so long that I've fallen into the habit of talking to myself, and I don't even realize it." "And you shout to yourself as well?" I laughed nervously. I'm like a hoarder who doesn't realize how badly his house is cluttered until somebody else comes into it. I don't know what I'm saying or doing half the time. The sad thing is that when I argue with myself, I lose those arguments. Marion gave the thin smile the thin joke deserved. It was an awkward moment, and it was a lie, but we powered through it. In fact, I did talk to myself, and Marion, overhearing me, didn't look upon my projected indefinite stay with enthusiasm. Neither one of us knew the other very well. Our connection, outside of the random childhood memories I still possessed, was through my mother. The cousins had finally bonded. Our 2 years in France cemented a friendship between Marion and Amy that would last the rest of their lives. Leaving Paris cracked my mother's heart, and her correspondence with Marion became her precious link to a world where she had felt more alive than at any time since. In that correspondence, my mother was at her most honest and most disappointed. Viewed through that lens, the children didn't come off well. We were a seemingly endless source of pain. David, always needy, self-centered, victimized, bounced from one unsatisfactory girlfriend to another. Alice was leaving her marriage to her insufferable but Jewish high school sweetheart and turning to lesbianism. How is that possible? Jean, already a lesbian, went from one act of familiar rejection to the next. I was unloving and judgmental and might never come home again. Where were the grandchildren to come from? At the beginning of my sojourn in Paris, the invitations did not come very frequently. Marion thought I was weird and unsociable, and perhaps I was. But I had other friends living in Paris and made new ones as the months went by. I didn't live in the second small apartment. They had bought a few buildings down the street as had David and Jeannie. I established myself in the working-class suburb of Saint-Denis, halfway between the Tour Montparnasse, where I taught English, and the Villeneuve campus of the University of Paris, where my departmental requirements included Old French, structural linguistics, and Greek tragedy. Marion was intrigued, and I was family. She began to thaw, and we started hanging out together, although we both led full and busy lives. When I shared some of the creative writing I was attempting in my studio apartment, that really softened her up. She liked artists, and she thought I had potential. I was rising slightly in Jean's estimation as well. The fact that my French was more literary and grammatical than his was only to be expected in one who aspired to la culture générale. And when he blasted me for not reading Le Monde on a daily basis, I knew I had finally mounted the lowest rung on the ladder of civilization. Further reward for my laudable ambition came when I was finally invited to spend a weekend at their country house in Vilja-Lied, a hamlet in the Oise Valley, an hour north of Paris. They had bought a tumble-down farmhouse just as my family was moving back to Pasadena, and I still possessed a few shards of memory from our one and only visit there. By the late 70s, they had thoroughly renovated it, turning the barn into Jean's studio and installing a guest room downstairs. My weekends there were always a festival of food and conversation. This Marion was bubbling, vivacious, intensely interested in other people if they were doing something intellectual or creative. Even Jean cracked a smile every now and again, relaxing into a diatribe about the spineless Socialist Party and sharing stories of his participation in the resistance. In town, Marion always had young people orbiting around her, and she introduced me to them when the occasion arose. She tried to set me up with a pretty Bulgarian woman who had come to Paris as a refugee, but I wasn't taking the bait. Marion found this puzzling, and of course wrote about it to my mother, but had no suspicion that I might be gay. Since Marion and my mother were so closely associated in my emotions, I kept her at the same arm's length as my mother. To Marion's credit, she never pried. She respected my privacy, although I was dying to talk about my confusing desires to somebody. I actually did manage to have my first sexual encounter with a man that subsequent winter. Within these limits, Marion and I became great pals. I knew nothing about her history, but she knew everything about mine. This didn't strike me as unbalanced. She told me about the Joris Ivens retrospective at the Pompidou Center. She unfortunately had to go to a film festival in Italy during that time, and I asked her who he was. She couldn't believe I had never heard of him. Par Lawrence, she quizzed further. I shook my head. John Grierson? Who are these people? You didn't watch any documentaries when you were growing up? I racked my brains. Woodstock, I offered. She'd never heard of it. It was truly a dialogue des sourds, as the French expression goes. But Marion gave me a truncated version of her relationship with Ivens. When I went to the screening of Indonesia Calling, I came away unimpressed. The subject matter didn't engage me, the editing seemed choppy, the soundtrack blaring and overblown, and the narration bordered on corny. Even with the Aussie accent, I recognized the ponderous voice of God from the educational films shown during my high school travails, The Defensive Driver, and I was not a fan. When Marion came back to town, she didn't ask what I'd thought of the film, and I let that sleeping dog lie. By May of '78, I had been offered a fellowship for graduate study in comparative literature at Indiana University for the fall. I would be leaving Paris, returning to my homeland, if not my home. Marion was excited for me. I would be living in the Midwest, equidistant from Chicago and Cleveland. I had cousins in both cities, lots of them. She drew me a family tree, but I'd heard of these people only a few times in my life. Aunt Julia, or not at all. Aunt Anna, Marion's mother. It all went in one ear and out the other. Jean Marion had missed my birthday in May, and so decided to share hers of June 19th doing whatever I wanted. I was already feeling sentimental about my beloved city and chose to walk down memory lane, actually Boulevard de la Grande Armée. We began dinner at Le Relais de Venise, still cramped, still unpretentious, and still delicious. Jean grumbled about having to line up at the uncivilized hour of 6 p.m., but Marion, who had eaten there with us as part of our family, knew it was the only way to get the first seating. Nothing had changed from 15 years ago. There was no menu. You were asked only how you liked your steak. Bien cuit, au point? Bleu, my father would respond, and the French took him seriously. We joked that he liked his beef mooing and still on the hoof. The tender meat arrived, drizzled with a creamy mustard sauce that set off the taste of the meat as well as the perfectly crisp fries that accompanied. And then, the miracle that won over the skeptical traditionalists who might be offended by the paper table coverings, the tight eating spaces, and the rapid service. The waitresses would come around with a second service of steak frites. Dessert was not part of the prefix, but it would have been sacrilegious to pass it up. Here there were plenty of choices, but I always went with the vacherin, a layered tower of ice cream and meringue streaked by a rich chocolate sauce and topped with whipped cream. The tower would fall after the first bite or two, but it toppled into a pool of chocolate sauce, so what was there to complain about? We stepped into the long summer twilight and walked up Grande Armée towards the comforting, familiar bulk of the Arc de Triomphe. We had to go past 37 Rue La Pérouse, where we had lived. Unlike Le Relais de Venise, our old apartment building had been visibly altered. The building looked gussied up, and a British pub and brasserie, Sir Winston Churchill, spilled onto the sidewalk. I laughed. A pub and brasserie? You think the Guinness stout pairs well with steak tartare? At least it's not a McDonald's, John snorted. You don't need a McDonald's, I returned. You have your own bad restaurant chains. Have you ever eaten at Hippopotamus? Merdique, Jean replied. That's your generation. Ah, the good old days, I teased. I wonder if they were all that good. We turned onto the wide, white sidewalks of the Champs-Élysées, and Marion came between us. Boys, she said gaily, linking arms with the both of us, don't fight. It's too beautiful an evening. I leaned in to kiss her. Happy birthday, chère cousine. We walked in silence for a bit, and then, of course, I remembered. Did you ever read the essay I wrote about Paris from Africa? You never sent it to me, Marion said. Amy did. Well, there were no copy machines in the bush. She said it made her cry. I was taken aback. She never told me that. Your mother has a very tender heart. She doesn't like to expose it. We passed the building that housed the American Library 15 years ago. It was no longer there. I felt myself tearing up. I'm leaving again, I said. Marion took my hand. Unconsciously, we had slipped into English, but Jean was used to that. He didn't mind. But she'll be back, she said. What choice is there about that? I have family here. With the insouciant optimism of youth, I moved back to the States, assuming that I could return to Paris any time I felt like it. I even kept a bank account there with a fund of French francs. As Africa gained more prominence in my academic studies and ambition, my connection to Paris waned somewhat. I did pass through the city en route to East Africa, the language and culture of Swahili being my new field of endeavor. But my visits with Jean and Marion were brief and mostly taken up with discussing the family, our great common theme. Marion knew of my ambition to write, and when we met, she would question me about my creative work, always encouraging me to persevere. She was a great enabler. I took her for granted, as I think my siblings did. She was as much a part of Paris as the Louvre or the Arc de Triomphe. In point of fact, I knew more about the origins of these landmarks than I did about the history that had brought my expatriate cousin to the 7th arrondissement. How had she come from Australia to a permanent berth overlooking the garden of the Hotel Matignon? I never thought to ask.
Ruska široka polje, jeduti popolju geroji, ekta krasni armi geroji.
Fatigue and entropy turned out to be the answer. While still in Australia, Ivens accepted an offer from the post-war government of Czechoslovakia to film a documentary praising the rapid development of the new socialist state. When Joris and Marion arrived in 1947, Prague became the base for a 4-part documentary touting the bright futures of the newly established socialist states of Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Poland, and Yugoslavia. The project was executed under the aegis of the Soviet-based Communist Party, more a curse than a blessing, but Joris felt passionately committed to the socialist future. The following 2 years of that future were consumed by the filming of the first years. Marion is credited as a co-writer, but she was more a general factotum, indispensable to the heavy lifting, not only of the challenging filming conditions, but also in navigating the tricky political maze of these new socialist democracies, each with its own expectations and the propaganda requirements of the Soviet Union. The mangled end product was destined for failure. Even behind the Iron Curtain, the first years didn't get much play, and only the most committed communist sympathizers in the West arranged for the screening of the few copies that were available. The first of these was in Paris in March of 1950. Joris and Marion arrived exhausted and emaciated. Everything in the Eastern Bloc was rationed. It was hard to eat properly, and the socialist currencies in which they had been paid were worthless. There was a brief period of recuperation for Ivens, who was in poor health, but he could never stop working. He collected an archive of his old films for Henri Langlois' Cinémathèque Française, then was off again, this time to Berlin, for another Eastern Bloc project. Marion chose to stay in Paris.
If there's a chance that you care, then please say you do, baby. Say it and make my craziest dream come true.
For 5 years, Marion had been Joris's inseparable companion. Their relationship had begun as a grand passion and had continued as such after their reunion in Australia. During the final stages of editing Indonesia Calling, Joris suffered an attack of bronchitis and asthma. He tried to soldier on, but eventually had to yield to a resuscitator. Marion completed the work. She then nursed him through a doctor-prescribed 6 months of fresh mountain air. This meant for Marion constant dusting, cleaning, and chopping wood for a big iron stove. Joris's slow convalescence eventually returned him to his endless ambition for film work, but his sex drive didn't accompany it. Though he remained devoted and tender, he was dead in bed. Marion accepted his invitations to accompany him on each next adventure in the hope that new challenges and a change of environment would revive their passion. But Joris didn't see his lack of sexual interest as an impediment to their continuing relationship. He even spoke of marriage. In refusing to join him, Marion tried to pressure him into taking their problem, that is his problem, seriously. She continued to hope that things would turn out well until she learned months after the fact that Joris had married a Polish woman unknown to her and 26 years his junior. Joris had remade his breakup script, but this time Marion was cast in the role of the discarded woman. She bounced back pretty handily, though, and she undoubtedly enjoyed having sex again. She never lacked for suitors. Returning to the States was an obvious option, but what for and which part? Even were she returned to the places in her past, New York, Cleveland, Los Angeles, she would have to start over again. McCarthy's Red Scare was poisoning America's political climate, another disincentive, and an old ex-communist beau had named her in testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was happy to remain where she was. The film people and writers Joris had introduced her to were becoming friends and colleagues. So slowly, Marion wrote me in a retrospective letter on the topic, Paris became home. Paris was only starting to rebuild its post-war economy. My father and mother came across with the geld for buying the flat on Rue Vanneau, and I had some savings from my Dutch government salary. In the Eastern Happy Lands, they only paid in local coin. I hadn't really decided that I would never return to the U.S. It was simply a case of finding Paris so attractive and having a nice place to live, getting more involved with work and people here. And when Jean came along, the matter was settled. And then, in parentheses, she wrote, no regrets. What joy there is in that parenthesis. She was 36 when she got off the Joris Ivens ride, and Paris was the place she landed. She hadn't gone there with lost generation fantasies, but she was ready to settle down. She bought an apartment and was married 2 years later to the man she would spend the rest of her life with. Jean didn't want children, and this was a decision that Marion had to accommodate herself to, but the parenthesis, no regrets.
I love Paris every moment, every moment of the year. I love Paris. Why, oh, why do I love Paris? Because my love is near.
End of part 1.